Joining me now in the House foyer, Arif Virani is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Heritage Minister. David Anderson is a Conservative human rights and religious freedom critic. And BC New Democrat MP Alistair MacGregor. Good to see you all.
Hello.
Hello.
Arif Virani, let me start with you. There are about 30 recommendations here, but none of them seem to suggest actual changes to the law. So I'm wondering what you actually accomplished.
Well, I think we accomplished a great deal with that study. I was privileged to sort of sit in on the hearings. The hearings looked at systemic racism and religious discrimination. They heard from a set of witnesses that dealt with everything from anti-black racism to anti-Semitism to Islamophobia, and including Indigenous discrimination, and they came up with a robust set of recommendations. I mean, some of the highlights are promoting more interfaith dialogue, promoting better educational materials, standardizing the definition of hate crimes and aggregating better hate crime data. And I think very importantly right now, there's also a call to empower people to come forward and report hate crimes. In the climate that we're seeing right now, when people are talking about harassment, it seems every day, we have to also think about people who are facing hatred in terms of racial hatred and racial discrimination, and how we empower those voices from coming forward. I think it's also very appropriate that we're doing that during Black History Month. We're doing that during the same week that we commemorated the massacre and the terror attack that occurred at the Quebec Mosque.
Right, but this is a motion and you're giving recommendations, none of which is binding. So I'm actually wondering why you wouldn't have said, we actually need to cement this in the law.
So I think concerns about what's in the law versus what's not in the law stemmed from the very outset of the motion that prompted this debate. The motion was a motion. It didn't change the law. It called for a study on systemic racism and religious discrimination. That's what the Heritage Committee has just done. What's important about any parliamentary standing committee is that when they make recommendations, they require a response from government. So the government and the Minister of Heritage will be responding to all of these recommendations, and they are comprehensive. They also call for something known as a national action plan to combat racism. There was such an action plan in 2004 under Paul Martin's leadership. It fell by the wayside under the Conservative government. So they're calling to resurrect an action plan, and that's an important step, again, in terms of this climate.
All right, David Anderson, I know the Conservatives were not happy with this original motion M-103 when it was tabled, and you've issued a dissenting report. So what is your main point in your dissent?
Well, I was very happy to be able to serve with Scott Reid and David Sweet as the members of the Conservative Party on the hearings on the Heritage Committee. And right from the beginning, we said this motion was too narrow and inclusive. We tried to amend it in the House and made a proposal for that, and the Liberals rejected that. So we went back to the original amendment, and that set the kind of the diameter, the framework for what we were studying. Right from the beginning, we knew that the word Islamophobia was one of those things that was getting all of the attention on the motion, and so we talked a lot at committee about that. We talked to witnesses about what is your definition of Islamophobia, and I think if you look at the appendix to our report, you'll find there's about 26, 27 different definitions of Islamophobia, and it ranged right from people saying that if you perceive that you've been offended, that's Islamophobia, right through to some moderate Muslims telling us we don't want to use the word because it continues to create more hate, more fear, and divide our community. We just as soon you set the word aside. So we're really focused on trying to lay that out so that people understand there's such a broad framework, a broad kind of series of definitions on that the word probably isn't the most useful thing to be using. We should be using things like anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Muslim bigotry. And also we do have a number of recommendations that are not kind of parallel to what the government has put in. One of them actually suggests January 29th should be a day of anti-bigotry and violence. So it's a little bit different. Scott Reid's motion, which we brought in a while ago, and the government now has responded to by saying we're going to reject that. We have something else that we want to put in place. But we worked very well together. We're happy to be part of this, and you've got three different reports. Ours has a different flavor to it than the NDP's does, which is different than the majority report on the government. But I think a good reading of all three of them will give people a good idea of what went on at the committee and the work that we did to try to bring Canadians together.
Let me bring in Alistair MacGregor. So what is the NDP's position? Where do you fall between these two, the Conservatives and the Liberals?
Well, I guess it's a general sense of disappointment over the partisan politicking that went on regarding the term Islamophobia. I think if you look at the terms anti-Semitism and homophobia, there's no debate over what those terms mean and what identifiable groups they are considering. So for me, it's no different for Islamophobia. If you look at the witness testimony that happened in committee, the statistics, we can see that over the past decade, there has been a clear rise in hate crimes against Muslims and those who practice the Muslim faith. Therefore, I think it's incumbent upon us as Canadians to recognize the problem, to develop specific policy goals and strategies to tackle it.
Could I just ask you to address David Anderson's point, though, because there were something like 26 different decisions or definitions of Islamophobia that you heard. So how could you pick one over the others?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you, yeah.
Well, I think like my colleague Jenny Kwan sat in on the committee for the duration of the study, and she agrees with the report, and we added a supplementary report. We recommended some additional actions that could be taken. Two of the key ones we wanted to see the committee go forward with was the creation of a federal, provincial, territorial meeting to actually address areas of specific hate crimes and discrimination, and also looking at how a study on the labor market and its achievement and integration amongst people of minority groups, religious faiths, and so on, how we can better encourage their participation in the labor market.
All right, well, let me go back to you, Mr. Virani. A Fed-Prov meeting, is this a good idea? Like, if the goal here is to try and raise public consciousness about this and to try to prevent these sorts of incidents, that would seem to be one way of coordinating the effort right across the country.
I would say 100% agreement, and I would just inform all of the viewers that we had the first federal, provincial, territorial conference on human rights in 29 years in Ottawa on December the 13th. That was convened by the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Heritage, and and Carolyn Bennett, where we discussed various manifestations of human rights domestically and internationally, including combating racism. But suggestions like that make eminent sense. And I think the point that needs to be underscored again and again for viewers is that we all have an understanding of the racism and the hostility that Alistair mentioned. We know that the stats have tripled between 2012 and 2015 of incidents of hostility and hatred towards Muslims. What we want to get on with is actually addressing the problem. The time spent on the debates about how to define one particular term is time not well spent from the perspective of our government. And it's also important to use terms that are being employed by the persons who are vulnerable and targeted themselves. The Muslim community stakeholders that we have been hearing from have used the term Islamophobia in reference to what happened in Quebec City on January 29th of last year. That's why the Prime Minister continues to use the term, and that's why we're committing to addressing it.
All right, David Anderson, what from your party's point of view, what has to happen next?
Well, there were a couple of things that came up that I think the committee members agreed on. One of them was data collection and getting a better set of statistics and understanding more what's happening in these crimes and incidents that are taking place. Arif mentioned that a little bit earlier. The other thing that we've suggested is more of a whole of Canada approach, we call it, rather than a whole of government approach. So rather than the government kind of stepping into every area of this, that we had communities tell us, if you would just help us get together, if you'd help the faith communities come together so we could have these kinds of conversations that we need to have, and if you would give us a spot when it comes to considering government policy, so we would have a balanced opportunity to present our perspective to the government, we would feel that we can do a much better job of dealing with these incidents. So those are kind of two of the things, but it was pretty clear the faith communities want to be part of the conversation, they want to be involved in this, and we would like to give them the opportunity to do that. And I think that's important. That's one of the ways, it's probably the best way that we have of solving these problems across Canada, is to get Canadians actually involved. Government's not going to solve this. We've seen this over the past few years, so it's obviously going to come down to us as citizens, and we want to try to work to deal with those issues of discrimination that everyone faces, including Muslims across Canada.
I've got about 30 seconds left. Alistair MacGregor, any last word of what you think needs to happen next?
Yeah, I think both Arif and David have raised some good points. There's a general willingness amongst everyone on this panel to deal with this problem and address the concerns. And to your earlier point about recommendations about law change, like the criminal code is a pretty blunt instrument to use. I think we can go beyond that particular instrument and institute policies where it comes from the government and it comes from the communities, as David mentioned. This is really going to take all Canadians working together to address the systemic racism that's in our midst and to finally come through it together as a country, because ultimately that's what's going to make us stronger.
All right, I got to leave it there. Thank you all. Arif Virani, David Anderson, and Alistair MacGregor.
Thank you.
Thank you.